Let's just put it this way. I would stay in a loveless marriage just to make sure I could be with Lena every day. That's how much I love Lena.
At 55, Kelly Ripa has almost everything television promised her. Decades of success, awards, a famous marriage, 3 grown children, and a place millions still recognize every morning. Yet behind that polished routine is a very different story. Her life has also been shaped by aging in public, children leaving home, painful changes in her body, difficult career transitions, and the pressure to keep showing up. None of it looks like tragedy on television. But together, the cost becomes much harder to ignore. For more than 2 decades, Kelly Ripa has walked onto a television set and done something that looks almost effortless. She smiles. She talks. She jokes. She listens. And then, the next morning, she does it all again. To millions of viewers, that routine became part of everyday life. But there is something strange about a career built around making life look easy. The longer it lasts, the harder it becomes to see what it takes to maintain. Ripa first became widely known as an actress before moving into daytime television. In 2001, she joined Regis Philbin on Live. What began as a new chapter eventually became more than 2 decades of mornings, interviews, jokes, headlines, and constant public attention. And with every passing year, something else happened. She aged in front of the audience. That matters more than it may seem. For most people, aging happens privately. A face changes slowly. A career evolves. Children grow up. A person's priorities shift. There are no cameras recording every stage. For Ripa, there were. The audience watched her become a mother of young children. They watched her career grow. They watched co-hosts come and go. They watched her become one of the most familiar women in American daytime television. And eventually, they watched her reach 55. That number carries a strange weight. Because 55 is old enough to look back at an entire era, but young enough to still be expected to keep moving forward. Television rarely pauses to ask what that feels like. It simply expects the next show, the next interview, the next smile, the next morning. And perhaps that is where the real story begins. Kelly Ripa has spent much of her adult life working inside an industry that values energy, appearance, youth, and consistency. She has joked publicly about aging and about the differences between herself and her husband, Mark Consuelos. There is humor in those conversations. But humor can also reveal something serious. A person who has spent decades being watched cannot experience aging in exactly the same way as everyone else. Every change becomes visible. Every new stage becomes public. Every decision can become a headline. And the pressure is not always spoken out loud. Sometimes it is simply the knowledge that tomorrow morning, millions of people will see her again. There is no hiding behind an ordinary day. There is only the next broadcast. That is the strange price of becoming familiar. The audience may feel as though it knows the person on screen, but the person on screen still has to live the years that the audience only watches. And while Ripa was building a career that seemed almost permanent, another part of her life was changing just as quickly. Her children were growing up. Ripa and Mark Consuelos have 3 children. For years, their lives were shaped around parenting, school, schedules, family routines. The endless small responsibilities that make up ordinary family life. Then something happens to almost every parent. The children begin leaving. Not all at once. Not with one dramatic goodbye. It happens slowly. A room becomes quieter. A schedule becomes lighter. A child becomes an adult. And suddenly, the person who spent years being needed every hour has more empty space than before. Ripa has spoken publicly about becoming an empty nester. That transition is easy to misunderstand. From the outside, it can look like freedom. And in many ways, it is. Parents get more time, more independence, more room to think about themselves. But freedom can arrive carrying another emotion with it. Loss. Not the loss of a person, the loss of a role. For years, being a mother was not simply something Ripa did. It was part of the structure of her daily life. Then the children began building lives of their own. That is what successful parenting is supposed to produce. Children are meant to grow up. They are meant to leave. They are meant to need their parents a little less. Yet knowing something is right does not make it painless. That contradiction is one of the quiet truths of adulthood. A parent can be proud and lonely at the same time, happy and unsettled, grateful, and nostalgic. And the hardest part is that nobody has to do anything wrong for that feeling to exist. Sometimes life changes simply because life moves forward. At around this point in the story, one question becomes difficult to avoid. When a parent spends decades building a life around children, is letting them go an act of love, or one of the hardest forms of loss? There is no simple answer. Perhaps there should not be. Because Ripa's experience is bigger than celebrity. It belongs to millions of parents who eventually stand in a quieter house and realize that the years they spent rushing through childhood were also the years they can never get back. And yet, while her family life was changing, her professional life continued. Every morning still demanded energy. Every interview still needed a smile. Every conversation still needed momentum. The clock did not stop because her children were growing up. Television does not work that way. Ripa joined Live in 2001. More than 2 decades later, she remains connected to the program. That kind of longevity is rare. It is also complicated, because when a job lasts that long, it stops being just a job. It becomes part of identity. Ripa is not simply someone who has hosted a television show. She became one of the people audiences associate with the show itself. That creates a strange psychological trap. Success can create freedom, but success can also create expectations. People expect the successful person to continue succeeding. They expect the familiar face to remain familiar. They expect the routine to continue. And sometimes, the hardest part of a successful career is realizing that the world may be ready for change before the person is. Ripa has spoken about the future of Live and about the idea that the franchise can continue beyond any single host. That is an important thought, because television history is full of people who believe their position would last forever. It never does. Hosts change. Formats change. Audiences change. Networks change. And eventually, everyone who works in front of a camera has to face the same question. How long is long enough? For someone who has spent more than 20 years walking into the same professional world, that question is not simple. Leaving would mean change. Staying means continuing to live under the same expectations. Neither choice is automatically right. And that is where the story becomes less about television and more about human nature. Because sometimes people stay in familiar places not because they have nowhere else to go, but because the familiar place has become part of who they are. Then came a reminder that even the most disciplined professional cannot negotiate with the body forever. In 2026, Ripa underwent gum graft surgery after years of gum recession connected to excessive toothbrushing. The procedure itself was not presented as some life-threatening medical crisis. That is important. The real significance came from something much smaller. Recovery required her to avoid speaking for 10 days. 10 days of silence. For an ordinary person, that would be inconvenient. For a television personality whose career depends on her voice, it was something else. Her voice is part of her professional identity. She talks for a living. She interviews people. She tells stories. She reacts in real time. She fills silence. And suddenly, healing required silence. That contrast says more than any dramatic headline could. The woman whose job was to keep the conversation moving had to stop talking. For years, she had been expected to show up. This time, her body demanded that she stay away. And there is something humbling about that. A person can have money, fame, a strong career, a busy family, a powerful platform. None of those things change the basic rules of the human body. Sometimes it needs rest. Sometimes it needs treatment. Sometimes it simply says no. And when that happens, even Kelly Ripa has to listen. That moment also reveals something about the psychology of constant performance. People who spend years being productive can become very good at pushing through discomfort. One more meeting, one more appearance, one more show, one more responsibility, until stopping feels almost unnatural. But the body does not care about schedules. It does not care about ratings. It does not care how important the morning show is. It has its own timetable. And perhaps that is why the surgery carries a deeper meaning in this story. Not because the procedure was catastrophic. It wasn't. But because it forced a woman whose life had been built around constant communication to become quiet. And in that quiet, there was another reminder. Time was moving. It had always been moving. The audience could see it in the calendar. Ripa could feel it in her own life. But television continued. And then there were the people who left. Over the years, Ripa's live career went through major transitions. Regis Philbin, Michael Strahan, Ryan Seacrest, and eventually, Mark Consuelos. Each transition changed the atmosphere of the show. Each person brought a different personality, a different rhythm, a different relationship with Ripa. That is one of the unusual things about television. A studio can feel permanent. The people inside it are not. For viewers, a co-host departure can feel like the end of an era. For the people working there, it is more complicated. They still have to arrive the next morning. They still have to fill the chairs. They still have to make the audience comfortable with a new reality. Regis Philbin's departure became especially personal. Philbin later said that Ripa was offended by his decision to leave, while he described his own reasoning as connected to age and the belief that it was time for him to move on. The details matter because they reveal how differently people can experience the same moment. One person may see retirement as necessary. Another may experience the departure as rejection. Neither feeling has to be fake. That is how relationships work. People can care about each other and still want different things. And once again, Ripa was left with the responsibility of continuing. That became a pattern. Someone leaves. The show continues. The audience adjusts. The cameras roll. And the person remaining has to absorb the change while pretending the morning is still normal. That may be one of the least understood costs of longevity. People celebrate those who stay. But staying means watching others disappear from the story. Some leave by choice. Some leave because their careers change. Some leave because time simply moves them somewhere else. And eventually, the person who stayed the longest has to ask whether she wants to keep being the one who remains. If these quieter stories about familiar faces are worth hearing, this is the kind of story this channel is built to explore. The lives behind the public image, the choices that rarely make the headline, and the human cost hiding inside long careers. A subscription keeps those stories going. Because the most interesting part of Ripa's story is not whether she has suffered more than anyone else. She hasn't. The point is almost the opposite. Her life shows how even a highly successful person can experience the same private transitions as everyone else. Children grow up. Parents age. Careers change. Bodies become less forgiving. Friends and colleagues move on. And eventually, a person has to decide what matters now. That may be the real emotional center of this story. Not tragedy. Transition. At 55, Ripa is standing at a point in life where the future cannot look exactly like the past. Her children are adults. Her career is established. Her marriage has lasted for decades. Her public identity is already firmly built. She no longer needs to prove that she belongs on television. But that creates a new question. If a person spends decades proving what she can do, what happens when the challenge is no longer proving herself? What happens when the challenge is choosing herself? That question reaches far beyond Kelly Ripa. It belongs to anyone who has spent years working hard for a life they once wanted. A parent who finally has an empty house. A worker approaching retirement. A person whose body no longer moves the way it once did. Someone who looks at old photographs and realizes how quickly the years disappeared. There is a particular kind of sadness in growing older. It is not always about losing something terrible. Sometimes it is about realizing that something beautiful is already in the past. The children were once small. The early career was once new. The old friends were once sitting beside you. The house was once loud. The body was once different. The future once seemed endless. Then one day, the future becomes a much smaller number. And that can change the way a person sees everything. For many viewers, that part of Kelly Ripa's story may feel strangely familiar. A career changes. Children grow up. Parents get older. The house becomes quieter. The person who once spent every day trying to keep up suddenly finds herself asking what comes next. That is not failure. It is not weakness. It is simply the price of time. And perhaps this is why the word tragedy needs to be handled carefully. There is no evidence that Ripa's life is secretly falling apart. The facts point to something more human. She has built a remarkably successful life. And even that life cannot protect her from change. She has awards. She has money. She has a long career. She has a family. She has a platform. But none of those things can freeze a child at age 5. None can keep a co-host from leaving. None can stop a body from aging. None can make a career last forever. And none can turn back the clock. That is the part of fame that the audience rarely sees. The public image creates the illusion of permanence. The person behind it still moves through time like everyone else. At 55, Kelly Ripa is still working. She is still connected to live. She continues to build projects beyond the traditional daytime format. She continues life with Mark Consuelos. And she continues to adapt to a world that does not look exactly like the one she entered decades ago. That matters, because the ending of this story is not a dramatic collapse. It is something quieter. A woman who spent years becoming a familiar face now has to live with the fact that familiarity does not stop change. The audience remembers the younger Kelly, the actress, the new host, the young mother, the woman standing beside Regis. Then Michael, then Ryan, now Mark. But all those versions are still part of the same person. And maybe that is what makes aging in public so difficult. The world remembers every version. The person has to carry them all. The real tragedy is not that Kelly Ripa lost everything. She didn't. The deeper truth is that even after building so much, she still has to let some things go. That is something fame cannot fix. And perhaps the hardest part of growing older is not losing the life once imagined. It is learning to recognize the life that remains. Kelly Ripa's story is still moving. There are still years ahead. There are still choices to make. There are still chapters that no television audience has seen. And somewhere in that future is another question that every long-running celebrity eventually faces. What happens when the person the world has known for decades finally decides she wants something different? That question belongs to another story. And the next familiar face may have been carrying an even quieter struggle behind the smile.